Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. William Lester. I'm with University of Florida IFAS Extension Service in Hernando County, Florida. And today I'm going to be covering the plant science module with you. So our learning objectives for this entire module, which is broken up into 3 different parts, is you're going to be able to explain basic plant processes that affect plant growth, classify plants by morphology using a dichotomous key. You'll be able to illustrate the importance of binomial nomenclature and botanical families to gardening and diagnostics. And you'll be able to recognize the basic parts of a plant and describe their functions. So let's go ahead and jump right into part 1 here, introduction. So what exactly is botany? Botany is a scientific study of plants. It looks at the plant's classification, evolution, the physical structure, either the internal or external structure of a plant, physiology, ecology, and uses. And botany is also normally known as plant science or plant biology. Those terms are all used pretty much interchangeably. So what exactly is horticulture? Horticulture is more the art and science of cultivating plants, which includes ornamentals, fruit, and vegetable plants. And once we know more about a plant's origin and the structure and functions of its different various parts, we're often able to do a much better job of being able to grow it. So what exactly is a plant? A plant is a photosynthetic multicellular organism. Plants contain photosynthetic pigments called chlorophylls. This is what causes the green color in plants. Plants are able to make their own food in the form of sugars and carbohydrates. And plants are able to store their own foods also, usually in the form of starches. So some basic plant processes. Photosynthesis is a very complicated chemical procedure about how plants are able to turn light energy into carbohydrates that are transported and stored by the plant. So basically, a plant is going to be able to use carbon dioxide and water plus light plus the chlorophyll, and what it creates is sugars, very basic sugars, and also gives off oxygen as a part of the whole chemical process. So respiration is the way that plants use the food and carbohydrates that it creates. It's how the carbohydrates are broken down into energy the plant can use. And this energy is used by the plant to build new tissues, or in other words, to support plant growth, for the plant to grow larger, flower, basically do all the things that a plant is going to do in its lifetime. So between the two, between photosynthesis and respiration, it's kind of a balancing act, because in photosynthesis, a plant is going to produce its own food, energy is stored, photosynthesis occurs in cells that contain chlorophyll. So any of the plant's cells and organs that contain the green pigment is going to be able to perform photosynthesis. Oxygen is released, carbon dioxide is used, and this occurs in the light. It requires sunlight for this to occur. On the other hand, when a plant uses that energy, it uses the food for energy. The energy is released. That can occur in all the cells inside of a plant. Oxygen is used, carbon dioxide is produced or given off, and that can occur either in the dark or in the light. So transpiration is another process that plants undergo, which is basically water movement within a plant. So this is the process by which moisture or water is carried through plants from the roots all the way up through the stems, through the leaves, until it's released as water vapor into the atmosphere through small pores or holes normally located on the undersides of the leaves called stomates. So some things that are going to increase transpiration is warm temperatures, bright sunlight, low relative humidity, wind, and moist soil. Because a plant will take up water through the roots. As you see in the diagram here, it travels up through the plant, through the stems, and exits through the leaves. So if the weather or temperature is warmer, this happens faster. Bright sunlight makes it happen faster. low relative humidity is actually going to pull the moisture and water out of the undersides of the leaves. Wind is going to increase water movement and possible water loss inside of a plant also. And excessively wet soil is going to increase transpiration also. So that is the end of part one. Hopefully we'll see you guys in just a few minutes when we're going to start on part two, which is plant classification. I'll leave a nice long pause in between the two sections here for you to cut that. Okay, welcome back, everybody. In this section, we are going to talk about plant classification. So plant taxonomy. This is the classification, naming, description, and identification of plants. Human beings naturally like to organize everything, and of course we do that with plants also. So we break plants up into different groups, we give it names, we put them in different smaller groups and even smaller groups all the way down to an exact plant species. So in informal plant classification, plants can be classified a number of different ways. We classify and break up plants by their life cycle. You're probably familiar with annual plants. These are plants in Florida that only grow for one season, or they may grow for one full year. Perennial plants grow for a number of years. Biennials grow for 2 years. It takes 2 years to start from seed, go all the way from flowering and seed production until the plant is done with its life cycle. We classify plants by latitude, where they grow. They could be Arctic, temperate, subtropical, or tropical. In Central Florida, we are a subtropical environment. In the very southern tip of Florida, it's a little bit closer to tropical. We divide plants up by how they're used. We use the kind of informal terms of fruits, vegetables, ornamentals. Plants can be used for fiber, for dyes. Some plants are used for medicinal purposes. Other ones are used for forage for animals. Or we can divide them up and classify them by their growing or flowering season. They can be considered warm season plants, cool season plants, sometimes wet season or dry season, all by the time of year when they grow the best and do the best. So how plants are classified botanically. Some of the earliest botanical classification schemes were phonetic, which is based on just the overall looks of a plant. And you can see a very old diagram here on the left of what that looks like. But more recently, botanical classification has shifted away from just going how a plant looks on the outside to looking much closer at the evolutionary relationships to try to get an idea of what other plants, the current modern day plants, evolved from and how closely they're related at this point. So some of the different things that botanists use to classify plants, some of the different evidence and schemes they look at to help divide them up. Embryology, this is developmental processes. Chemotaxonomy, that's the chemical composition of a plant. They might look at the cell structure and function of a plant. Anatomy, or the internal structures. Morphology, and this is the internal structures. Morphology is how a plant looks on the outside. Paleontology, which is pollen structure of plants. And more recently, genomics, which is looking at the DNA of plants and comparing it with other plants to see which plants are more closely related and which ones are less closely related. So the hierarchical arrangement of plants, and this falls over to all other areas of life also. I'm sure that you're very familiar with the animal kingdom. There is a plant kingdom also. There is one for bacteria. There is one for fungi. So starting at the largest classification, we have the plant kingdom. Then plants are broken up into smaller groups called phylum or phyla is the plural, then down into classes, orders, families, and then into even smaller groups, they're broken up into a specific genus, and then the smallest grouping of a plant would be a species. And species is always written in lowercase and italicized, or if you're writing it by hand, since none of us can write in italics, you're supposed to underline it. So you see family, genus, and species are the ranks that are most relevant to gardeners. You're not worried so much about what phylum a plant is a member of or class, but we are concerned with and looking at plant families, and then the genus, and then the individual species. Because by knowing the family, genus, and species of a plant, it really helps you to know a lot more about a plant, its appearance, and how to grow it. So here is a really good example of how a specific plant is classified. And the picture in the upper right-hand corner here is of a Loropetalum chinense, or Chinese fringe flower. So you can see it's in the green plant kingdom, land plant phylum. The class is angiosperms, which are all flowering plants. We go lower and lower down. The genus would be Loropetalum, the fringe flower, and then the species, the entire species written together, is Loropetalum chinense, which you notice is written in italics. So the person that we could thank for modern day binomial nomenclature or classification of plants is Mr. Carlos Linnaeus here. And Linnaeus was an accomplished physician, botanist, zoologist, and teacher who lived in Sweden in the 1700s. And he's basically considered to be the father of modern taxonomy. And many parts of the way that we classify plants also falls over to the animal kingdom, fungi, and many other organisms. So what this does is it allows for the unambiguous identification of any given organism with just two words, which is the genus and then the epithet. So the two of them together makes up the specific species of what any one plant is. And it was first used in the mid-1700s. So before this, people would just use a lot of adjectives to describe the plant, maybe how it looks, the flowers, the shapes, the shape of the leaves. And you can see the name, the scientific name of this one plant, pre-Linnaeus, was pretty lengthy and pretty difficult for anybody to really work with. But then after Linnaeus put together his system of binomial nomenclature, we have just a two-word name for every specific plant on the face of the earth. So this comes in really handy because the other way that we like to name plants or refer to them is through common names. And common names can be a real problem because you see this one plant right here. All these different names are used for this one plant. So buttercup, corn buttercup, field buttercup, it goes on and on. This may differ depending on what part of the country you live in. Obviously, if we have one specific plant that grows in a number of different countries or grows on different continents, people in each one of those countries or continents is going to use a totally different common name. So how on earth would scientists, gardeners, or anybody else be able to communicate and refer to one specific plant with other people in the world? That is why we use scientific nomenclature for plants and not common names. Common names are fine, maybe to kind of classify it and organize it in your head or speaking with another gardener, but it can become very, very confusing because I know a lot of plants that, all depending on exactly who you talk to, has totally different common names. So down below the species level, some plants we go even lower below species. So subspecies or varieties, they develop in response to geographic separation or unique ecological circumstances. So an example of a Florida species that is divided into subspecies is our native beach dune sunflower, Helianthus debilis. It's divided into 3 subspecies or varieties that occur in different parts of the state. These can vary in habit, stem modeling, leaf margins, and the type of hairs on the stems, so they do sometimes look a little bit different. The bottom photo on the slide here is a cultivar of Camellia japonica, the common garden camellia. These are called cultivars because they were bred or selected by man or plant breeders. You won't find them growing in the wild. So sometimes plants can be bred by human beings or plant breeders. Other times it happens naturally out in the wild. So vascular plants account for the majority of plants that gardeners grow, the ones that you're most commonly going to deal with. So we're going to discuss each of the different subgroups, a little bit on ferns, cycads and conifers, and flowering plants separately. So pteridophytes, or ferns and their relatives, they all do have true leaves. They differ from seed plants like gymnosperms and angiosperms because they reproduce by spores and they do not have any kind of flowers or technically true seeds on them. So fern life cycle, as you can see from the diagram here, is very complicated. Ferns go through a lot of different steps between sprouting and growing and reproducing. So you can look this over. Just remember the ferns are kind of complicated plant organisms. Something a little bit more common that you're going to deal with a little bit more often are gymnosperms, and this includes cycads, conifers. Conifers are evergreens or pine trees, and ginkgo. So gymnosperm means naked seeds. So gymnosperms do reproduce by seed, but those seeds are not enclosed within any kind of ovary or a fruit. So they do not produce true flowers or fruits. They do have pollen and ovules. They are produced in separate male and female cones, and they reproduce and disperse by means of seeds, which lack an endosperm. So some good examples of gymnosperms that you probably have in your yard or are very familiar with are going to be any kind of pines or pine trees, kuntis and podocarpus, and also sago palms, which we call sago palms, but they're not technically true palms. True palms are something different. So angiosperms, which are the plants that you're going to encounter the most often, angiosperm means container seed. So angiosperms reproduce by seeds that are contained within some type of ovary or a fruit. So the pollen and ovules are produced by specialized structures called flowers. They're dispersed by means of seeds, which have an endosperm. And then traditionally, angiosperms or flowering plants are all divided up into 2 other groups called monocots and dicots. So monocots are plants that when they first sprout and come out of the ground, they have one cotyledon or seed leaf. If you cut into the stem, they are structured differently inside. The stems inside have scattered vascular bundles. The leaf veins are usually parallel. The floral parts are generally in threes, and they don't have any kind of secondary growth, so they don't have any true wood or bark. Some really good example of monocots would be corn, any kind of grasses. Palms are also monocots. And dicots, which make up the majority of flowering plants, when they first emerge, first sprout out of the ground, they come up with 2 seed leaves. So that's really the easiest way to be able to tell them. They are structured differently inside of their stem. So they do have vascular bundles in rings. So if you think about if you cut down a tree and you look at the cut part of the trunk, you see everything in rings because most trees are going to be dicots. Their leaf veins are usually reticulate or branched out or netted. Their floral or flower parts generally come in 4s or 5s. and dicots are capable of secondary growth. So they do get true wood and bark on them as they grow older. So angiosperms are a little bit more complicated than that. They are broken up into a number of different groups. We're only going to focus on just a couple of them. Right now, they are technically subdivided into 4 subgroups. Scientists have this really bad habit of changing up the rules every once in a while. It's just because the more we study plants, the more we learn about them and how they're divided up and how they're identified and related through DNA testing. So in the real world, basal angiosperms and magnoliids account for only about 2% of angiosperms. So some examples of those are water lilies, star anise, magnolias, nutmeg, a few others. Monocots, like I mentioned, corn, any kind of grasses, palm trees, bananas, account for 23% of all angiosperms. This includes orchids and bromeliads also. So the eudicots, or true dicots, make up the majority of angiosperms. They account for 75% of them. And this includes all the more commonly known plants, things that you're very commonly going to see in the landscape, like oaks, roses, cacti, mints, and asters. So at this point, that was a little bit of terminology overload, I think. Don't think that you have to memorize all these terms, because coming up in the next section, we're going to have even more terms in this section today. So why don't you guys go ahead and take a short break and try to digest that. You may want to be able to watch the video more than once for it to make a little bit more sense. But go ahead and take a break, and we'll see you back here in just a few minutes for the third part. Let me take a breath also. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Welcome back to part 3 of plant science. We're going to talk a little bit about plant morphology, and this is the third and final part to this module. We're going to go over a lot more terminology, because in the world of plant science, every specific little part to a plant has a name to it that we want you to be familiar with and have heard of it. But please don't think that you have to memorize each and every term we're using in this section, because even I have to look things up a lot of times. I don't have them memorized. If you're not working with plant classification, identifying plants every day, a lot of times these terms kind of escape your memory, and you have to refer to literature for them. So let's cover a little bit about plant morphology. So plant morphology is basically the study of the physical form and external structures of a plant. This helps you understand a plant's functions, how a plant works, how a plant goes through its life cycle and does what it needs to do, and its habitat preferences, and most importantly, how to best grow it. This also helps you recognize some of the most common plant families, because plants and plant families tend to have a lot of things in common. They share some similarities. So they do share a lot of morphological characteristics, actual visible characteristics. So one good example is the Lamiaceae, which is the mint family of plants. These are really easy to identify or tell, because the stems on these plants, once they get a little bit older, if you rub the stem between your fingers, they're quadrangular or square. They have square stems. The leaves are opposite, simple. They often have an aromatic glands. Think mint plants in your garden. The flowers are perfect, usually tubular and two-lipped. The calyx is often enlarged and persistent, and the fruit is a drupe with 4 stones and a schizocarp with 4 nutlets. And you're probably wondering, oh my gosh, what do all those words mean? We're going to cover and talk a little bit about more what these different terms mean. But this is how you would, if you're looking at a book, the actual written description you would find for Lamiaceae or plants that are in the mint family. So how you try to figure out plant morphology, the first thing you want to do is examine the entire plant. So you want to take a look at the entire picture. You want to look at the habit. Is the plant woody, which would be a common tree or shrub or subshrub? Is it herbaceous, which means it's woody? Herbaceous plants never get actual wood in them. So this would be an herb or a smaller plant. Or self-rutescent, which is mostly herbaceous, but sometimes develops a little bit of a woody base over time. So in other words, from looking at a plant that you're trying to identify or learn more about, is it a tree, a shrub, an herb, or a vine? Keep in mind that a vine could be herbaceous, woody, or self-rutescent. That's a hard word to say. And then again, if you're looking at a very, very young plant, you can't necessarily tell at this point whether it's going to grow up to be a tree, a shrub, an herb, or a vine. So you also want to look at the form of the plant. Plants are classified by whether they're upright or sprawling or arching or rosette. They could also be trailing or prostrate. Prostrate is actually laying down on the ground. Trailing is more of a vine. Upright is, think more like an oak tree. Sprawling would be many different hedges that you might see in a landscape. You need to look at the branching pattern on the plant. So is it unbranched? Is it well branched? Does it branch down near the base? Of course, things like size, the height, and the width are very important to make note of also. Seasonality. Is it deciduous? Deciduous means that it is going to drop its leaves for a fairly long period of time, normally during the winter. Up north, it's always during the winter, but down here in Florida, things are a little bit different. So some trees and plants might drop their leaves for a very short period of time, get their leaves back on them, in which case they're technically not deciduous. That would be more briefly deciduous. Or is the plant an annual or a very short-lived plant, a perennial or biennial? And then you also need to look at the hardiness of the plant. Because here in Florida, Florida is a very long, large state. We have a lot of different growing zones in Florida. So in parts of Florida, we can successfully grow tropical plants. Other areas you can't. Some plants are tender, some ones are hardy. Things that live further up north are hardy. So these are all things that you need to look at in plant morphology. So then we're going to take a little bit closer look at each organ from the ground up. So starting at the very bottom, you have the roots, then you have the stems, then the leaves, the flowers, and the fruits. And these are all important when you're trying to classify or when you're looking at plant morphology. So a little bit more on plant roots. Roots are obviously very, very important to a plant. They serve the function of, they are the primary way the plants absorb water and minerals. So all the water and nutrients that enter into a plant generally are going to come in through the roots. Roots are important for actually physically anchoring the plant in place and holding it up. Or if it's an epiphyte or an air plant and it's attached to something else, it holds it in place. Roots are very important for conductance. This is the movement of water and minerals. And water and minerals move up through plant structures called the xylem. The xylem is, think of it as the plumbing inside of a plant. That is what the water is going to move up through. And then sugars move up and down through a different part of the plant, and that is called the phloem. So in the xylem, it's always water, and it always moves up. And then phloem is always sugars, and sugars can move up or down in a plant. And then roots are also very important for storage. They help to store water and carbohydrates. If you think of certain plants like potatoes or sweet potatoes, those roots, those modified roots, are where the plant stores starches for the winter or for the dormant season that it's going to need to regrow the next year. So in the world of roots, there are primary roots, which is also known as a taproot. There are secondary roots, which are smaller fibrous roots. There are adventitious roots, and these are specialized roots that arise out of either a stem or some other part of the plant, usually above ground. And root hairs are very, very important to a plant because root hairs give a root a lot more surface structure, and root hairs are the most important part of a plant for actually taking up water and nutrients up into the plant. So here we see some pictures on a plant of the primary root and some of the secondary roots that are coming off of it. And then here's another picture here of a little piece of a plant stem, and the roots that are coming off of that stem are the adventitious roots. And the picture of the plant on the left shows a fibrous root system. And then on the right here, we can see another plant with the taproot down below the soil line, the soil surface, and then the stem up above. So tree roots are a little bit different. Trees here in Florida generally don't depend as much on their large taproot as trees do up north. Trees here in Florida tend to have a large number of very small absorbing roots, and that's how a tree takes up the majority of its water and nutrients. It does have other roots that obviously go deeper to hold the tree in place. That's very, very important as the tree gets larger and heavier to hold it stable. And the lateral roots are the roots that go out sideways and go far and wide, basically in search of water and nutrients. So a little bit about stems. Some of the functions of stems are conductance, because stems contain the xylem and the phloem. Those are the tissues that, remember, xylem is the water conducting tissue. So water moves up in a plant through the xylem, and then phloem contains the sugar transporting tissue, which moves sugars and carbohydrates up and down within a plant. Stems support and elevate the leaves, flowers, and fruits. If the plant is upright, it's what actually holds the plant up in the air. Stems are also very important for water and carbohydrate storage. So sometimes stems can play a role in photosynthesis. If the stem is green, as a general rule, that means those cells contain chlorophyll, and they're going to be able to perform photosynthesis. Stems are very important in certain plants for gas exchange. A lot of stems on especially different types of trees contain small holes called lenticels. This is very important for gas exchange, for air and carbon dioxide to come in and out of a plant. These are very important on deciduous trees. So these trees lose their leaves, and if the leaves are gone, the tree can't basically breathe. So it does breathe through lenticels in the stems. And then sometimes stems can play a role in plants' defense. Think of thorns. Something like thorns are going to help a plant to defend itself against predators and other things that may try to damage it or eat it. So on a stem, you see a diagram on the right here with all the different parts on a stem. So nodes are where a leaf or leaves are attached, and the spaces between nodes are called internodes. A bud is a growing point on a stem that may be very, very small. It starts off literally microscopic and then starts to swell up a little bit more and forms a bud. That is where another branch could emerge from the stem and grow sideways. So buds are the very important growing points on a plant. So at the very end of a stem, the growing bud there is called a terminal bud. Lateral buds emerge at the base of the leaves and they grow sideways out of a stem. And then adventitious buds may develop on injured stems. So if a stem gets broken or injured, it may develop an adventitious bud to help to try to replace that stem. So inside the stem, like I mentioned already, we have two different types of tissues, phloem and xylem. Phloem conducts the photosynthetic products bidirectionally. That's a really complicated way of saying that it moves the sugars that are produced through photosynthesis in leaves. It moves them up and it moves them down. Xylem conducts water and minerals unidirectionally, which means just one direction. It only moves the water up. So the water comes in through the roots, up through the stem, and out through the leaves. Both of these tissues are produced by the vascular cambium, which is a structure inside of the stem. So different types of stems have different terminology and different descriptions to go with them. So just some examples of different types of stems here. It could be a crown stem, a simple stem, a branched one, climbing. Rhizomes and stolons are very common with many plants and many turf grasses. So you see the picture of Bermuda grass here produces rhizomes. A rhizome isn't a root. It is actually a below ground stem. So it's a modified stem that stays below ground. St. Augustine, on the other hand, produces what looks like the same thing, but the term for it is a stolon because it is an above ground stem. So below ground stem is a rhizome, above ground stem is going to be a stolon. So some different specialized modifications of stems. Certain stems could be used for climbing. So if you think of vines, vines have many different ways that they could climb up a fence or up a tree. They can twine, they can produce tendrils, which are specialized stem modifications that actually curl around something to help hold the vine up. So those tendrils could derive from the stems. They could come from the leaves, leaflets, or from the inflorescence, which is terminology for the entire flower. So if you take a very close look at the tendril, a lot of times that really helps you to identify the plant. Tendrils can be clawed, twining, have adhesive discs. So there's a lot of diversity when it comes to tendrils and stems. Certain types of stems can be used for storage. So those underground stems, the underground modified stems, rhizomes, are used a lot of times for storage. They store starches for the off season or for the winter. So if you've ever tried growing gingers before, we call them roots, but what they really are is underground storage stem or a rhizome. If you think of tubers, if you think potatoes, other plants will form things that look very, very similar, but technically they're not. So taro or cocoa yam form something that's called a corm. So all of these may, if you're just glancing at them, look very similar, but botanically they're all very, very different in plants. So some stem modifications can be used for defense, and there are a lot of different sharp, pokey things on plants, and they all have different names. Some of them are called thorns. A thorn is actually a modified stem. If it's a modified leaf, it's a spine. And if it's a modified hair on the plant, either on the leaves or the stems, it's called a prickle. So different plants have different ways of defending themselves, and they all have different terminology. So a little bit about leaves. Leaves are obviously very, very important in plants. Some of their specific functions are the absorption of sunlight, or leaves contain the cells that contain chlorophyll. So the chlorophyll is gonna absorb the sunlight and perform photosynthesis. Leaves are the primary spot for photosynthesis. Like I said, there are some stems and other plant parts that perform photosynthesis, but not very often. Leaves also perform gas exchange, so they can absorb carbon dioxide, they release the oxygen. They're important for transpiration. When I mentioned that plants take water up through the roots, it moves up through the stems, it leaves through the leaves. On the underside of the leaves are stomates, or little breathing holes. This is where the water leaves the plant. And then leaves are also used for storage. So leaves can store carbohydrates or starches sometimes also. In some plants, the leaves may be modified for climbing, which would be a tendril. Sometimes they're modified for plant defenses, which would be a spine, or the leaves are modified for pollination. They almost look like petals. They look like they're a part of the flower, but technically they're not. So some of the morphology of leaves, the different parts of a leaf. The blade is the main flattened, expanded part. The petiole is a tiny little stem that attaches the leaf to the stem. A stipule is a little leaf-like appendage at the base of the petiole. The base is the blade, the leaf blade portion that's closest to the stem. The tip or the apex is obviously the tip on the other end. The margin is very important when you're trying to identify plants. That's the edge of the leaf blade, and how it's shaped can be very diagnostic when you're trying to identify a plant. The midrib or primary vein is the most prominent, largest vein in the center of the leaf. And then the secondary or lateral veins, any little veins that leaf might have coming off the main vein, are the secondary or lateral veins. So leaf arrangement is very important. Sorry, I'm going to have to do this section over again because I forgot to turn off my email. So hold on a second. Let me click that. That's okay. Second time is always the charm here. So are the dogs all set? Okay. Hopefully the dogs are all set, and we will go ahead and try doing part 3 once again. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Welcome to part 3 of plant science. And don't worry, this is the third and final section for this module. And we're going to be going over some more terms in this section. So please don't think that you have to memorize all these different terms. Even those of us that work with plants every day don't necessarily have all of them memorized. I have to refer to glossaries sometimes myself. But these are all very important different parts of plants that are all very diagnostic when you're trying to identify or classify or describe a plant. So it's very important that you're familiar with the different parts and also some of the other functions of how a plant actually performs the different functions that the plant has to perform to grow and thrive and do well. So plant morphology is basically the study of the physical form and external structures of a plant. Morphology helps you understand a plant's functions and habitat preferences and how to best grow it. Plant morphology helps you recognize different plant families. Sorry, let me go back and up. I didn't get very far that time, but the third time's the charm, right? Okay, welcome back, everyone. Welcome to part 3, or plant morphology. Trust me, this is the third and final part of plant science, and we're going to go over a lot more technical terms in this section, but plant morphology is very important when we're trying to describe or identify a specific plant or get a better understanding of exactly how a plant goes about doing what it needs to do to grow and be healthy and thrive. So don't think that you have to memorize all these different terms that we're going to go over in this section. It's important that you're familiar with these terms and you're able to look in a glossary or a book, or if you're reading a written description of a plant, you understand what these terms mean, but don't think that you're going to have to memorize each and every one of them. So plant morphology is the study of the physical form and external structures of a plant. Plant morphology helps you understand a plant's functions and habitat preferences and how to best grow it. Morphology is very important when you're trying to recognize plant families, because the more closely related plants are, and all the plants in any given plant family are fairly closely related, it's going to help you get an idea of the different morphological characteristics that plants within a certain plant family share. So here is a really good example of that. We have the plant family Lamiaceae, or the mint family. And the stems of these plants are often quadrangular, or to put it in simpler terms, with these plants, once they get a little bit larger, if you roll their stem between your fingers, the stem is square. The leaves are opposite, simple, often with aromatic glands. The flowers are perfect, usually tubular and two-lipped. The calyx is often enlarged and persistent, and the fruits are a drupe with 4 stones and a schizocarp with 4 nutlets. And if you're thinking, oh my gosh, what do all those different various terms mean? We're going to cover all of them in this section, but this is a good example of a description of a plant family and the different specific characteristics that, as a general rule, they're all going to share. With anything biologically, there's always an exception to every rule. So if you haven't been told that yet, let me share that with you. But as a general rule, there are a lot of different things that plants in one plant family are going to share. So when you're looking at plant morphology, first you want to look at the entire plant. So some terminology of how we describe how a plant grows, a plant's form. You're going to look at its habit. So is it woody? So woody plants would be trees, shrubs, subshrubs. Is it herbaceous? And herbaceous just means that it's non-woody. So think like an herb or vegetable plant. Or is it suffrutescent, which is mostly herbaceous, but sometimes when it gets older, it develops a woody base over time. So in other words, is this plant that you're looking at and trying to describe, is it a tree, a shrub, an herb, or a vine? Keep in mind that vines could be any one of the above at different points in its life. So you want to look at the plant's form. Does it normally grow upright? Is it sprawling? Is it arching? Is it rosette? Is it trailing? Think of a plant that grows, more along the ground, or a vine. Is it prostrate, laying on the ground? You're going to look at its branching patterns. So is the plant unbranched, well-branched, branches near the base? Obviously, the size, the height, and the width are very important also. Problem with that is a lot of times you're looking at a description of a plant and it gives you the mature height and width. So if the plant you're looking at is very young, you may not know yet what its mature height and width will be. You need to have an idea of the seasonality of the plant. So for woody plants, they could be deciduous. That means that it drops its leaves for a reasonably substantial part of the year. So if you think of trees up north, when they drop their leaves in the fall for the winter and they're bare over the winter, those are deciduous trees. Is it evergreen? And even evergreen trees, if you think pine trees or some other kind of evergreen, they will lose their needles or leaves bit by bit. So they do fall off over time. They just don't lose them all at the same time, all at once. Or are they briefly deciduous? And then herbaceous plants could be annuals, perennials, or biennials. That means, does it live for just 1 year? It takes 1 year to go from seed to growing to flowering, making a seed, or does it grow year after year? And then something else you need to look at is the plant's hardiness. Is it tropical, tender, or hardy? And then you're going to look at each one of the organs from the ground up. So we're going to look at each one of these a little bit more in depth. But starting at the bottom, obviously the roots are at the very bottom, the stems, the leaves, the flowers, and the fruits. So looking a little bit deeper at roots, some of the different functions of roots, they are very important with the absorption of water and minerals. This is the primary way a plant gets all of its water and minerals and nutrients. Roots are obviously important for anchoring a plant in place. It physically holds it sturdy and steady and upright in the ground. Roots are important for conductance. The water and minerals move up in a plant through xylem. We're going to look at that a little bit closer in a few slides. And the sugars within a plant can move up and down within a plant also through a structure or an organ called the phloem. And we're going to look at that a little bit closer also. And roots are sometimes very important for storage of water and carbohydrates. So some of the morphology of roots, the primary root or taproot is the main root that goes, it's generally the largest and it usually goes generally straight down. Secondary roots are roots that come off of the primary root or taproot, and they're also called fibrous roots. Adventitious roots are roots that come from either a stem or some other plant part, but not from a root. So a good example of this would be a tomato plant. Tomato plants on the stem up above the ground sometimes will try to form roots, and it will go through the air till it hits the ground and down into the ground. That's an example of an adventitious roots. And there's other examples in other plants. Root hairs are very important to a plant. They are tiny outgrowths that absorb the majority of the water and minerals that a plant gets through osmosis. So they're very, very tiny roots, but they have a very large surface area and they take up a lot of the water and nutrients in a plant. So here we see some pictures. This one plant on the top here, you can see the primary root, and then the secondary roots are the smaller ones that come off of it. Below this, we see a leaf that was probably a leaf cutting. So you can see a little tiny piece of the plant stems. And now we have adventitious roots that are coming off of them. These are adventitious roots because they're technically growing off the stem. So adventitious roots are roots that come from a plant part other than other roots. In the picture on the left, you can see an example of a fibrous root system. And on the right, you see a plant here that has a taproot. It has the one main root. If you see where the soil line is on this picture, below the soil line is the taproot, and then above the soil line is going to be the stem. So with trees, especially trees here in Florida, they do sometimes have taproots, but generally not as big or as important to the tree as taproots are in northern trees. Here in Florida, trees have large numbers of small absorbing roots and lateral roots that don't go very deep, but they do go very far and wide. They do a very good job of kind of searching for water and nutrients. And then the sinker roots are going to be larger ones that go a little bit deeper in the ground that help to keep the tree erect, which is very important as the tree gets larger and older and heavier. If you think of like a large, mature live oak tree, it obviously has to have some fairly sturdy roots holding it in the ground, otherwise it would just fall over from its own weight. So stems, some of the functions of stems. Stems are very important for conductance. This is done through the xylem and the phloem. Stems are important to support and elevate the leaves, the flowers, and the fruits. Stems can be very important for water and carbohydrate storage. They actually store a certain amount of water and nutrients. In some plants, some stems can also play a role in photosynthesis. So if you see a plant and the stems are green, that generally means that the cells in the surface of the stem contain chlorophyll, and they can and probably do perform photosynthesis. Stems are important in gas exchange. Many trees, especially deciduous trees, ones that lose their leaves during the winter, have little tiny holes in the stems called lenticels, which are very important in gas exchange. If you think of a tree, if it loses its leaves in the winter, how does it, move oxygen and carbon dioxide into and out of the tree? It uses lenticels on the stem. They're tiny little breathing holes. And then some stems can play a role in plant defense, things like thorns and spines and prickles, to help naturally protect that plant from predators and things that may want to damage it or eat it. So you see a diagram on the right here of a stem with the different parts on that stem. So nodes are points where a leaf or leaves are attached. And then the space between one node and the node next to it is called the internode. And these are very important sometimes in plant descriptions. So buds are the growing points. If you look at a stem at the very, very tip or terminal end of the stem, that's going to be the terminal bud. And that is a spot where a plant can grow from and become longer and larger. Lateral buds form at the base of the leaves, and these are the buds that can emerge and grow stems that grow sideways. And then adventitious buds sometimes develop on injured stems. So if a stem or a branch gets broken or damaged, it may form an adventitious bud. So if we cut a stem in half and look inside, what we're going to see is two different structures. One of them, the phloem, is the structure that conducts the photosynthetic byproducts or the carbohydrates that a plant produces for food. It moves those bidirectionally or up and down. So a plant can move the sugars or carbohydrates up if it wants to, up to maybe a growing point, up to a developing flower or fruit, or the plant can move them down into the roots. If you think like a potato or a sweet potato or a tree that's going to go dormant for the winter, it's going to move those extra sugars to the roots to store them for the next year. Xylem is the water conducting tissue inside of a plant, and it only moves water in one direction. Water goes from the roots, and it always goes up and then exits through the leaves. So both of these tissues are produced by the vascular cambium. That's the structure just inside the outer wall of a stem. So different stem types, stem terminology. There's a lot of different types. There's a crown stem, simple, branched, climbing. Two very important ones that maybe you think are roots, but they're really not. They're really stems. The picture on the left here of Bermuda grass, it produces rhizomes. And a rhizome is technically a below ground stem. So even though it looks like a root, it's really a modified stem, and it generally grows below the ground. If we had a rhizome that looked generally the same, but it was growing above the ground, the technical term for that is going to be a stolon. So for anybody who's familiar with St. Augustine grass, it produces stolons, which are above ground stems. And that's how it grows sideways. Those aren't roots, that's a modified stem. So some different stem modifications. They can be modified for climbing or twining. They can form tendrils. Tendrils can either be produced from stems, leaves, leaflets, or inflorescences, which is the entire flowering structure. So the position of a tendril can give you a clue to its origin or where it came from. Tendrils can be clawed, twining, they can have adhesive discs. They have many different ways of attaching to a plant and being able to crawl upwards. Some stems are used for storage. So like I already mentioned, rhizomes, another good example of a rhizome is going to be gingers. If you're familiar with them or you've grown them before, the Storage root type structure is technically a rhizome or a modified stem. Stem tubers, if you think of potato, a regular baking potato. And then other plants have something called a corm. So taro and some bulb plants has something that looks similar, but technically it's different. It's a corm. So some of the stem modifications for defense, if the stem modification comes from a stem, it's called a thorn. If the little sharp pointy thing comes from a leaf, it's a spine. If the sharp pointy thing comes from a modified hair, technically it's a prickle. So you see plants, every different part of a plant on different plants really does have its own special term. So a little bit about leaves. Some of the different functions of leaves are they absorb sunlight. So the cells within a leaf contain chlorophyll, and this is the main area where most photosynthesis and sugar production occurs. So leaves are very important for photosynthesis. They're also very important for gas exchange because stomates on the bottom side of a leaf is where water exits from a plant, but they're also very important for carbon dioxide to enter the leaf and then oxygen to also be given off back out through the leaf. Leaves are important for transpiration or water movement or the potential loss of water. And then sometimes leaves are used for storage of sugars and starches and carbohydrates. So the morphology or the different parts of a leaf, you see the diagram on the right here with the different parts. The very tip of the leaf is called the tip. The main flattened part is the blade or lamina. The margin of a leaf is very important when we're looking at describing trees and plants and leaves. How that margin is shaped is very important to help identify that plant. The midrib is the center rib in the leaf, the most prominent central vein. The smaller veins that run off of that are lateral veins. The petiole is a small stem that attaches that leaf to the branch or the actual plant. How the leaves are arranged is very important. Alternate leaves, you see the diagram on the right-hand side here. Alternate leaves, if you look down the stem, they're kind of stair-stepped, starting at the tip, one, the next one a little bit lower, next one lower, next one lower. Opposite leaves are where you have two leaves that are directly across from each other. And then whorled is where you have three or more leaves that are all attached to the same node or the same growing point. This is also very important when you're trying to identify plants. So how those leaves are arranged on the stem, they can be spiral, they can be distichous, which leaves, they're two ranked. You can see from the diagrams on the right here, we can have an alternate spiral, alternate distichous, opposite decussate, whorled. These are all different terms for exactly how the leaves are arranged on a plant. With leaves, we have simple leaves and we have compound leaves. A simple leaf has just a single leaf blade. You see on the very far left here, that is just a simple leaf. The whole leaf is just one simple leaf. But some plants have compound leaves. So if you look at the picture of the compound leaf, all those tiny little leaflets on that one little stem there makes up the whole leaflet. And how those leaflets are arranged can vary quite a bit from one plant to another, and is very, very important when we're trying to identify plants. So if you're wondering, how can I tell if this is a simple leaf or a compound leaf? What you want to do is you want to look for that little axillary bud. So axillary bud, as you see in the top picture here, if you see the axillary bud, what is attached to that is the leaf. So up above is just one leaf, so that's a simple leaf. The compound leaf, the picture down below, you see the smaller stem with all those different leaves. It makes up one compound leaf, and where it attaches to the plant is a bud. So by finding the exact location and placement of that axillary bud is going to help you figure out whether the plant you're dealing with has a simple leaf or a compound leaf. So how many different leaves are on this slide? We have simple leaves on the left here. Like I said, they can be odd pinnate, even pinnate, which is just the total number of leaflets. Is it an odd number or an even number? A lot of different ways that leaves can be arranged on a plant, and they're all very, very important when trying to figure out the exact name of that plant. So a couple little additional terms here that are associated specifically with compound leaves. The leaflet is the unit of a compound leaf. The rachis is that extra little stem that holds all the little leaflets to the main stem. And the petiolate is the individual stalk of the individual leaflet that holds it to the rachis. So here are some different various terms on how a leaf can be attached to a plant. So this is very important if you look at the diagrams at the bottom. Petiolate has, in this picture, it's a simple leaf, and it has a single petiole that holds that leaf to the stem. The stem could be budding up. The leaflet or leaf could be budding up to the stem, in which case it's sessile. The leaf can actually be wrapping partly around the stem. That would be clasping. So these are all different little things that you're going to have to look at with the plant when you're looking up a description. So here are some very common leaf shapes, and I'm not going to go through all these, but you can see all these leaves are shaped a little bit differently, and each type of shape has a term attached with it. So when you're looking in a book or a plant identification book or tree identification book, you're going to encounter these terms when the book is trying to describe the leaf of that tree or plant. The leaf tip is very important. That's very diagnostic also. So how the leaf tip is shaped, whether it comes to a point, whether it's completely curved, whether it comes to a little bit of a point, whether it kind of dips in like retuse and emarginate, is all very important when trying to identify plants. At the other end of the leaf base, the shape of that, and sometimes you have to look very, very closely to see the exact shape. If you're trying to look between acuminate and acute, it might take a hand lens or a magnifying glass to actually get a good look at how that leaf is shaped at the very bottom. Each one of these has a different terminology and a different description that goes with it also. So the leaf margins, or the very, very edge of the leaf, depending on how it is shaped, is going to be diagnostic for a plant. And there's a number of different terms with that. If it's just a smooth, straight margin, it's entire. If it's a little bit wavy, it's undulate. If it's at all sawtoothed or pointy, it's going to be serrate. That could be finely serrate, coarsely serrate, doubly serrate. So a lot of different terms and shapes go along with leaves. The exact texture of a leaf is very important also. So there are different terminologies that go along with whether the leaf is kind of papery or leathery, or if it's very, very thick and fleshy. The leaf surface, number of different terminologies go along with that. Glabrous means it is hairless, because many times a leaf will have very, very tiny hairs. Once again, a hand lens or a magnifying glass really comes in handy when trying to identify plants, and especially plant leaves, because you may be looking through a plant guide and it says, you know, whether the leaf has very, very fine hairs on it or not. Sometimes the only way you could tell is looking through a magnifying glass to be able to see the hairs. So the leaf veination, or how the veins in the leaf are exactly arranged, is diagnostic also when trying to identify plants. They can be parallel, they can be pinnate or palmate, reticulate. So here are some different terminologies that go along with that. Like I mentioned earlier, I think stipules. Stipules are little leaf appendages that are usually paired, that are located at the very, very base of the petiole, and is found in just certain select plant families. So depending on whether a plant has stipules or not, or how they're arranged, can be very important on discovering which plant family a plant is a member of or not. So if you look at these pictures, you're going to think, oh gosh, we're up in the flowers already. Well, no, these are not flowers. What these are specially modified leaves or bracts. So probably the most easy to understand example of this would be the poinsettia on the left. If you look very carefully at that, the flowers are actually the small yellow structures in the very center. The brightly colored, what you might think are petals, the red ones, are not actually petals or a part of the flower structure. Those are modified colored leaves. So some plants will have bracts, which are usually associated with flowers, but technically it's a leaf and not a flower. So talking a little bit about flowers here. Flowers have very important functions also. So flowers are very important to attract pollinators. The petals, or sometimes the sepals or bracts, are very important to lure pollinators. That is what actually attracts or lures the bees or butterflies or one of the other insects to the plant, which are, you know, critical in pollination. Flowers are critical in reproduction, because what happens to a flower is after it becomes pollinated, it becomes a fertilized ovary. That is what develops into the fruit, which contains seeds. So fruits are important to us as a food source. Fruits are important to plants to help disperse their seeds. So a lot of plant classification is based on floral morphology. I know a lot of the experts that we depend on to help us identify a plant will tell us sometimes that they really can't identify it for sure from the pictures we take unless it has some kind of flower or fruit on it. Flowers are that important when making diagnostics. So you see on the diagram on the right here, some of the different parts of a flower, the petals or corolla, the sepals or calyx. So looking at the flower here, the ovary is at the very center inside. The sepals are the generally green, non-colored parts. The petals are generally the colored parts of the flower. The pistil contains the female parts. That's where the pollen enters and goes down into the ovary to actually fertilize the ovary. The anthers and filament contain the pollen. So you can tell from this diagram, if a bee was to come into this plant to look for nectar, that is how a bee, you know, that's where the pollen gets all over the bee to be moved from flower to flower. So complete flowers have all the different various parts to them. They have the petals, sepals, stamens, and pistils, which is both the male and female parts. The perfect or bisexual flowers have both the stamens and the pistils. The imperfect flowers or unisexuals, which you do find on some plants, are going to be, will have either the male parts or the female parts. So in some plants, some members of the plant kingdom, one plant will be a male plant and another one is going to be a female plant. Probably the best example of that you'd probably be most familiar with is certain hollies. Certain hollies, only a female holly gets the flowers that actually develop the fruits, the little red fruits, and the male ones will flower also, but they just contribute the pollen that goes to pollinate the female ones. So flowers have a tremendous amount of variety. They come in every different color and shape and variety. If you look very, very closely, they all have all the same basic parts. but exactly how they are shaped, it can be very, very different. A lot of times this is because the plants have developed over literally millions of years with the insects or birds or bats or animals that help to pollinate them. So the flowers are going to have very specific shapes and structures that are going to be very, very attractive to the pollinators because they make a team. They can't get by without each other. So the plant is going to develop different various structures to help attract the pollinators. And sometimes that's the largest reason behind why different flowers are going to have dramatically different shapes. So flowers are adaptations for pollination, the structure, the color, the scent, the timing of the flowers, what time of year they come out in. Some plants will have all the male flowers flower first, and then when they're gone, the female flowers flower because the plant needs to cross-pollinate with a different plant. So plants, the way they flower and the way they pollinate is really all over the place. So here are some examples, some basic pollination syndrome character table, some of the different flower colors and flower odors that are especially attractive to all the different pollinators. And if you weren't aware of it, if you thought that the only thing that pollinated plants was bees, there are bats. So obviously bats are going to be very important for pollinating plants that only flower at night. Bees, and not just honeybees, we have a huge number of native bees here in Florida that are important for pollination. Certain fruit trees have very, very specific species of beetles that are the only pollinator for it. So obviously it's critical to have those beetles in the environment when the plant is flowering and trying to set fruit. Birds help to pollinate plants, butterflies, flies. A lot of plants are wind pollinated, so all it really just takes is a little bit of wind to blow their pollen around and get from the flower on one plant to the flower on the next. So here's a famous example. If you look at the flower on the left here, Darwin's orchid, if we were able to dissect that and you're thinking like, oh my gosh, how on earth is that going to get pollinated? You know, what kind of insect is going to have this really, really long structure to actually make it inside the plant, get to the pollen and pollinate it? Well, there's obviously the Morgan Sphinx moth, pollinator or a moth or a butterfly or some other insect or animal that has specific specialized modifications for every plant. So flowers, if you're looking at a plant and you're trying to diagnose or figure out what species of plant it is, are the flowers solitary? Are they in groups? So a solitary flower obviously is just a single flower that's born at the end of a peduncle. And then an inflorescence is a flower cluster or the entire group of flowers. It can be branched, it can be unbranched, it could be branched in many different ways. And that's very diagnostic or very important to know. The individual flowers could be sessile, which means they don't have any stalks, they come straight out of the stem, or they can have little short flower stalks, also known as pedicels. So here are some diagrams about how different flowers, individual flowers can be arranged in an inflorescence. And this is very important. This tells whether it's a determinate inflorescence or an indeterminate inflorescence. Here are some more diagrams of different flower groupings. And this is going to be very important when trying to figure out exactly what plant you're looking at here. You can see that they can be in very small clusters, very large clusters. I know the compound umbel and the panicle. Many of these are very important in the world of fruiting plants and fruiting trees. So a little bit about fruits. The function of a fruit to a plant is to protect the developing seeds. So it's the physical barrier that's between those immature seeds that are in the center of the fruit or inside of the fruit and the environment. And then fruits aid the plant in the dispersal of mature seeds. So even if a plant makes a fruit that is very, very tasty to us, or maybe an animal in the environment, that's in the plant's, uh, best consideration there, because that animal is going to eat the fruit and then, excrete the fruit in its feces and help to spread the seeds, whereas maybe the plant isn't able to do that. So plants kind of work as teammates with certain animals that eat the fruits and help to disperse the seeds. So some of the different parts of a fruit, the fruit wall, the outer part is the pericarp. That consists of the exocarp, which is the skin, mesocarp, which is the flesh. The endocarp is the pit or the inside. Different types of fruits are broken up into different groups. Things like apples are called palms. Peaches, plums, and nectarines are drupes. Other ones are berries. So you see a picture of a grape here. Botanically, that is technically a berry. Citrus fruits or hesperidiums, they have the little sections inside with little juice vesicles. That's how you can tell hesperidium. So fruits are the ripened seed-bearing ovaries of flowers. So fruit starts with the flower is pollinated, the ovary is ripens up, it turns into the fruit, and then the fruit contains the seeds. Fruits are extremely varied in color, form, size, texture. They can be used as a distinguishing characteristics of a species or a specific cultivar. And they're divided into 4 really large categories. They're either dry or fleshy, or they're dehiscent, which means when the pod becomes ripened, it splits open on its own, or indehiscent, which means it doesn't split open. So some dry fruits, you see all the different terminology that goes along with it here. Achenes, samaras, true nuts. Legumes are also beans. So if you picture a green bean, if you leave it on the plant long enough, it's going to become fully ripe. The seeds inside are going to become full-sized. It turns into an actual seed pod. Fleshy fruits are many of the different ones that we eat, and also obviously a variety of different birds and animals eat them also. They could be simple, which is going to be a drupe or a berry or a hesperidium. Like I said, that would be a citrus or a palm. They could be compound, which means that they are from separate different carpels from one flower. So if you think like a blackberry is a fruit that has a number of seeds technically in it, or magnolia, a strawberry, or it could be a multiple fruit, which means that it came from a number of individual little flowers that all fused together to make that one generally great big fruit. Really good example of that is a pineapple. So pineapple came from a number of smaller clustered flowers that all grew and fused together to form the one great big fruit. So seeds have an outer coat or a testa, which is usually tough to help protect the seed from the environment. Angiosperms have the nutritive tissue or the endosperm. That's why we eat a lot of seeds. Think like, sunflower seeds and many of the other different seeds that we eat. Seeds contain the embryo, which upon germination turns into a new plant. And seeds can be anything from very, very, very tiny, like, the size of dust, to much larger also. So the University of Florida Herbarium was established in 1891. They have approximately 500,000 specimens there. It is the oldest, largest, and most comprehensive botanical collection in Florida. And you can see the numbers on all the different dried and pressed and preserved plants they have there, along with the library, the wood samples. They have a huge collection of fungi, for people who are trying to identify a fungus or a mushroom. It contains specimens from every continent except Antarctica, but mostly obviously the geographic focus is general Caribbean, because this is in Florida. So what they have here is these are some examples of some of the specimens here. And these are actual dried preserved plants that they have on hand. in case there's ever a question about, is the plant in your backyard this plant, that plant? If they have to, they can go and refer to the specimen plants there. So I know that the University of Florida Plant ID and Information Service, I use a lot. It's very, very important for me in my job. They do provide free identification of vascular plants. Many times they can identify plants from a good picture, but it needs to be a good picture, good clear picture, and pictures of the entire plant up close. Obviously, if it has flowers, fruits, specialized structures on it, you want to get pictures of those also. You can send pictures to them. You can see the link here at the bottom of your PowerPoint slide for where and the forms that you can fill out to submit samples. They will identify them. If they need more information, if they need a sample, they will get back with you and let you know that. But I know for myself, 99 times out of 100, if I just sent them some good, clear pictures, they get right back to me with a definite identification of what it is. So for acknowledgements, I really want to thank Mark Frank, who is the extension botanist. He works up there at the University of Florida Herbarium, and he is fantastic at plant identification. I depend on him a lot to perform my job. And then this presentation was adapted from a PowerPoint that was originally developed by Dr. Elizabeth Lamb from Cornell University. So with that, thank you very much, everybody. It was really, really great going through this section with you. And good luck with the rest of your Master Gardener course. Oh my goodness, that was a long PowerPoint. Hopefully you guys can use this okay. If there's any problems, please let me know and I'll try it again.